Well, thanks, Scott. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Scott told me I only had an hour, so I decided to write a book. So, so we got a couple extra. If anyone's interested at the end, I can help you out with that. But anyway, wow, what a great crowd. Thank you all for coming, and looking forward to visiting throughout the day. I want to tell you a little bit. Let's see. So go ahead, and I'll give you a high sign here. So today's presentation. So, in this country, we have the most abundant, cheapest food in the whole world. But at the same time, we live in the sickest country in the whole world. And they don't think there might be a connection with that? I do, and I'm going to share that with you today. And maybe some of the things that we can do about it. Big Ag really got us into this mess, and Big Pharma and regenerative organic agriculture, I think, can get us out. So I'm going to be talking and focusing a lot about healing the earth by growing food as medicine. Okay. So go ahead. I have lots of graphs, and I don't have lots of graphs and lots of statistics, but I have lots of stories. And that's what I'm going to share with you of what I've learned along the way. It was mostly by the School of Hard Knocks. So I want you to know I wasn't born organic. I wasn't schooled in soil or human nutrition or business. In my youth, I had no appreciation for the connection between good food and good health. And all that changed, and here's how and why. Okay. This is my hometown, Big Sandy, Montana, established in 1887. Now it's down to 600 population. When I graduated from high school in '66, it was 1,000. And half Main Street is boarded up. You see that brown shed, though, or brown building just down next to the Redmond. We were so excited. A month or two ago, a couple brothers moved to town. One was a veterinarian, and the other was a taxidermist. And they put a big sign over their establishment that said, Big Sandy Veterinary Clinic and Taxidermy. And then in very small letters, it said, either way, you get your dog back. So, okay. So let me share a little bit of my history in Big Sandy. Big Sandy opened up for homesteading about 1910 to 1915. That's when it was settled. And my great-grandfather traded a dairy he had in Idaho for a wheat and cattle ranch near Big Sandy in 1919. This is his harvest crew at a thrashing machine. 15 people were required to run this operation. And he had a thrasher, and he would go to the neighbors as well as his own and thrash around the countryside. He had a daughter that I should also say that he introduced summer fall, which is a way we could save moisture, and we're only in 12 to 14-inch rainfall area, so we can't grow a crop every year. And they found that out pretty quick, so that they would summer fallow one year and then raise a crop the next. Go to the next slide. This is my grandfather. He came, it's Emmett Quinn. He came back from World War II and married his old girlfriend that he left to go to war when they were in Idaho, Alice McAnally, in 1920. And they started our farm on 320 acres. He had about, in 1920, and it increased about 1,800 by the time my dad took over in 48. He mostly had cows, and that was his favorite thing. But he did do some cropping, and here he is on his first pull-type combine he got in 1926. And now instead of 15, got 3 people that can do the harvest, one on the tractor, one on the combine, one with a team of horses carrying the grain away. So that was a big improvement. He plowed up the prairie. And so in 28 years, he used up most of the nutrition that was in the soil that had taken thousands of years to accumulate. He had pretty hard times. The 30s came as drought, depression, Dust Bowl. And so he was a survivor, though. So he was one of those that was able to survive. And then my dad, the next one, my dad came back in 48 and took over. Now he's got a self-propelled combine. And my sister and I are the truck driver. So there's still 3 doing the harvest. He increased the farm to about 2,400 acres, which is what we had when I grew up on it, half crop, half cattle. He parked the plow, so he didn't plow anymore. He started in the strip cropping to try to add some conservation practices to stop the erosion of the soil. He introduced ag chemicals to feed the crops and to kill the weeds. And his goal was high yields, that was a national goal in those days. Okay, we'll go to the next one. Now I came back to the farm in 78. My goal was survival. These are pretty hard times, we thought. But the things that I did over the last 40 years is add value to crops, converted our farm to organic, and introduce new crops we'll talk about. Okay, on the next one. So this is my most important crop. We had 4 daughters and then 11 years of drought. And then a son came. So we had 5 kids, and unfortunately, none of them showed up at the door to take over. But I always tell people that's my most important crop. Okay, go ahead. And my early years, I grew up in Big Sandy, and I had 2 loves, plants and science. And I decided to put those together, and I went to Montana State University and studied botany and plant pathology. And then I went on to UC Davis and studied plant biochemistry. And after 10 years of university, I thought that was enough. I tell you, my folks really thought it was enough. And I was a little disillusioned with academia. It was really got to be a point in those days, in the mid 70s, it was lab against lab. And so the labs I was working with, we were told when we went to conferences like at Riverside, don't talk to the people in this other lab because they're doing the same thing we are, and they're in competition for the same money for grants. And I thought, wow, is that the way science should be done? Where we can't even talk about it. We can't even, I thought science was to push back to found the frontiers of knowledge and work together and solve problems, but it wasn't that way. And so I was a little disillusioned. So I came back to the farm, and but I tell you what, I didn't come back to change anything. I thought everything was pretty well the way it was, going pretty well the way it was. And but when we got back to the farm, we soon found out that 2,400 acres was just right in north central Montana for 1 family, but a little small for 2. And now my parents were still there. My family and I were there. And so I tried to figure out what can we do to bring more money into the farm. And I didn't want to go to town and get a job. I'd come home to run the farm. And I didn't want to send my wife to town to get a job because I had 3 little kids. She had a full-time job as it was. And besides, she was such a great help at harvest time. I couldn't lose that. And seeding. So we started finally, after a couple false starts, we started Montana Flour and Grain, selling our high-protein wheat directly to whole grain bakers in California. And this really worked out. They gave us a premium of $1 a bushel. In those days, the wheat was selling for about $3. So this is huge. And it started to turn the whole tide of the farm around. So let's go to the next. So 1 year went by and everything was just going perfect. And then in the summer of '84, Jim Torres, our biggest customer, called up from California, and he said, "Hey, Bob," he says, "we just love your wheat you're selling down to us, and you think you can find some organic wheat in the same kind of quality?" And I said, "Oh, sure, Jim, don't worry about a thing. We'll have it down in 10 days or so." And I hung up the phone and I thought, oh my gosh, what did I just say? I said, I don't even know any organic farmers. In fact, I didn't even believe in this organic stuff. I'd heard about it in California, but I had been taught all my life that a plant couldn't tell the difference between a molecule of nitrogen coming out of a manure pile and one coming out of a bag of ammonium sulfate, for example. But I'll tell you what, I didn't want to let my prejudice stand in the way of giving the customer what they wanted. So I started making some calls, and I called all over the state, and finally in the northeast corner up by Saskatchewan and North Dakota, I found a couple organic wheat farmers. And I went up with my truck and I had them sign a little statement that said it was organic and according to what California law was in those days, and that was it. And took it back to Fort Benton, about 300 miles away, and cleaned and baked it and sent it to Jim. And a few weeks later, he called and said, "Well, Bob, that was great. Can you get me another load?" And then another load. And I thought, my gosh, I don't even know that many, there's that much wheat in the States. But I was able to get through and find enough for his needs. And then I started going, these guys, I made a whole bunch of new friends. And they started inviting me to their winter meetings and get-togethers. And, I had been raised in Farm Bureau and grain growers and going to those meetings all each winter. And, a lot of times it was, woe was me, the prices in the toilet, and the government programs aren't giving us what we need, and on and on and on. And what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And when I went to these guys' meetings, there was none of that kind of talk. They were talking about how they could walk across their field and feel the change in the tilth under their feet. I thought, wow. And then they were saying how they could grow their own fertilizer and their own inputs. They were growing them and weren't buying them and weren't spending money for them. They were not using herbicides anymore because they were doing rotations to break up weed cycles and disease cycles and other problems. They didn't need any of these chemicals, these pesticides and herbicides. And then the scientist in me kind of bubbled up to the top, and I said, wow, we got to try this. So I went home, I said, told my dad, okay, go to the next slide. I said, Dad, we got to try this. We got 20 acres in alfalfa, just a little spot next to our regular field. And I said, I'm going to take that 20 acres. So it was planted in 83. So now we're in 86. And we summer followed it that year and did a soil test. We had 96 pounds of nitrogen in it, which is about right, what we'd like. And we fertilized the 20 acres right next to it with urea up to 96 pounds equivalency. And then we planted winter wheat. The only difference was my friends told me, my new organic friends said, now, with weed control, you've got to have ground cover. You've got to be able to compete against these weeds with something. So instead of using my winter wheat drill, which was 14-inch spacing, which is what we did, making big furrows, catch snow, and everybody said, oh yeah, that's what you have to do. I used my spring wheat drills, which were 7-inch spacing. And so that's what we used in the fall. And of course, unfortunately, the fields are right next to the road to town. Everybody said, what in the world is Quinn doing? He's got his spring wheat drills out in the fall. That's not going to grow. It's all going to winter kill. And then they found out that I was doing an organic experiment. Well, they figured I'd been in California too long, you see. So I didn't care. I just plowed ahead. And of course, they said, well, it's all going to winter kill. So I was out there first thing in the spring to see what was coming up. And by golly, both of them fields were coming up just about the same. I was so excited. Okay, we passed the first test. And then, of course, they said, well, you're not spraying, you're going to have weed problems. And guess what happened? That year we had late season rains, which where we live, our rains stop about the end of June, and that's it. And so we sprayed 2,4-D. Right in those days, we were spraying our 2,4-D at the end of May on winter wheat or 1st of June. And then that was it. We didn't need to worry again. But in that year, we had these late season rains, early July, and the weeds started growing. And my father's little 20 acres had 14 inches between the rows. The grain was standing straight up. There's a lot of sunshine and space between the rows, and the weeds all started coming. And kochia was a real bad one. And at harvest time, it was almost a problem. We had so much kochia. Next to it, the organic field, I had zero weeds, zero, because the grain had covered the ground so that it was so shaded that the weeds didn't grow. I mean, they were there underneath the canopy, but they didn't come up. And I said, wow. Well, I didn't say too much, but I my father was a little frustrated by this. And then at harvest time, when we harvested, the organic side got 33 bushels, 15% protein, 15.3, and the non-organic was 34 and 16% protein, almost the same. It's no significant difference. And I said, wow, Dad, look at this. And I was so excited. My experiment had worked. He was astounded. I mean, he had been spending tens of thousands of dollars every year for all these inputs. And this young whippersnapper scientist had just showed up from California and equaled his yield and quality without any of this stuff, using the alfalfa as the input. So anyway, I said, Dad, wow, let's do 50% in organic next year. And he said, whoa, whoa, whoa. He said, we have no idea what we're doing, which of course was true. And he said, how about 10%? I said, how about 25? He said, 15. So we increased our organic section of the farm to 15% the next year. Now, next year was 1988. We had a drought year. And in Montana, I don't know how it is here, but when we have drought, we normally have grasshoppers. And the grasshoppers are just alive everywhere in the pastures. And they were starting to come now as the pastures were drying, coming into our fields. And well, I knew what to do with my chemical fields. Just call up the spray guy in town and say, I got grasshoppers, be there in the morning. Here comes the plane, malathion all over everything. Everything's dead in about 20 minutes. And then my organic fields, I said, oh my gosh, what am I going to do here? And they called up my friends, what are you going to do for grasshoppers? And they said, oh, just calm down, calm down. There's a product called Nosema locusta. It's a protozoa. You put it on wheat bran, you spread it in edge of your field. The grasshoppers come in and they eat it. And as they lay dying and kicking, you know how they, in their last throes of life, their friends all come and eat them. It's just like politics in America today. So anyway, they did that and they all got sick. And so even though they ate in about 15 or 20 feet into the field, clear down to the ground, by harvest time, they were gone, and there were no grasshoppers in my organic field. And meanwhile, across the coulee where the chemical field was, the malathion had wore off and dissipated about 10 days or so. The grasshoppers were starting to come in again. Well, we couldn't afford to spray it twice. It was already a poor crop, and we didn't. So at harvest time, with the non-organic field, we had almost as many grasshoppers in the combine tank as we had wheat, and the organic field had no grasshoppers in the combine tank. And I said, Dad, look at this. We've done 2 years now in a row. We've equaled or bettered what the best of the chemical guys said we should do and could do with organic principles and methods. I said, I'm done with chemicals. And my dad said, okay. And I really appreciate that about him. So maybe you guys have any young daughters or sons that come home with wild ideas, just give them a little slack and give them a chance. And that's what my dad did for me. And I really appreciate that. It wasn't all easy. We didn't figure it out right away, but go to the next slide. But I was so excited that with my experiment, I became a passionate convert to organic agriculture. And I wasn't afraid to tell anybody anywhere. Meanwhile, the bar talk was, well, is he going to go broke first, or is he going to come to his senses, and go back to reality? But I didn't do either of those. So in our farm, what it did, it lowered the cost of the inputs we purchased by about 2/3. It increased the value of what we sold almost double, or 50% to 100%, because of the organic premium now. And it increased the agronomic and the economic viability of the farm. And within just 3 years, we were able to eliminate our operating note. We had never done anything like that before. In fact, our operating note was getting to be a problem. It was getting bigger every year. We were not able to pay it off every year. And the banker was starting to say, you're going to have to do something different. You're eating into the equity of your farm. And so far, and then we eliminated all that. And it made farming more fun. To me, it was really fun. Every year was like an adventure. How are we going to focus on the wet or the dry or the whatever we had coming, and how are we going to do that in an organic way? So go to the next slide. So after 40 years of research on our farm, these are the regenerative organic principles I came up with. First of all is diversity. So what we do, and I tell my friends, if the closer you can mimic nature and look around you into what's natural, is there any monoculture there? In the forests, in the prairies, in the rivers, in the lakes, there's no monoculture anywhere. It's completely diverse. You have all kinds of organisms that are taking from the system and giving to the system in a perfect cycle of self-interdependence. And that's what makes it work. The next principle is soil health. We try to create healthy soils using green manure cover crops to nourish and increase the biology of the soil. We minimize soil disturbance by reducing tillage and eliminating altogether poisons. And chemical field systems mostly are focusing on feeding the plant. That's the industrial model that we have mostly around us. It's focusing on getting high yield as possible by feeding the plant. In organic systems, we focus on feeding the soil. And we think if we have the soil as healthy and viable as possible, that will feed the plant. Okay, go ahead, the next one. So you hear a lot of talk about regenerative and organic these days, and it's a little bit confusing. So why is that? Well, we started with organic in the 1980s, and at that time, natural was a big thing. But because natural started, there was no legal definition for natural. And pretty soon, everything was natural everything. And so because it meant everything, it didn't really mean anything. And we attached sustainable to organic. So we said that organic was sustainable. And that gave an idea of what we're trying to do. And then all of a sudden, Monsanto said they were sustainable. I said, never really thought of it that way. And so we, in 1990, went to Washington, a group of us, with the idea that we would put the organic definition into a legal definition. So it couldn't be co-opted. It couldn't be greenwashed. It couldn't be taken advantage of by people who really weren't interested in following the principles, but just looking at a better market. So that's what we did to avoid losing the meaning of the word. Now we have regenerative coming, and that's really interesting because regenerative to me and is really focusing on the soil. I think that's really important. And some parts in organic has gotten away from that a little bit. People are starting to think, the thing that scares or concerns me the most is the industrialization of organic. And that means going back to the idea that we feed the plant, but we feed it organically instead of nourishing the soil. And I think that probably the most extreme example of that is hydroponics, which there's no soil at all. And we're just strictly feeding the plant, and yet that can be organic. So I'm a little bit frustrated with that. But with regenerative, there's no legal definition, so it can be meaning almost whatever anybody wants to say it means, and that varies quite a bit. So I think, why don't we take the best of both worlds and combine them and make something called regenerative organic? And so, go to the next slide, please. And let me show you an example of what I mean by that. Think of a ladder. One side is not complete, this kind of a ladder without the other side. And people who are coming from the organic side, rooted in the definition of the law, or if you're coming from, I'm still going, focused on soil health from the regenerative side, I applaud either of those people starting up that ladder just as much as I can. I think that's and say, okay, we've arrived. And now we're better than anybody else. But I think that if we get to the top where we can combine two, one is just as deficient without the other. Organic is just deficient without regenerative as regenerative is without organic, in my mind, for the total picture. So that's what I encourage people to think about. Okay, next move. So how does it work on our farm? We have 12 to 14 inches of rainfall. Most of it comes in May and June. We rotate our crops cash crops with soil building crops every other year. We go from fall seed, the spring seed, the broadleaf, the narrowleaf, the late season, the early season, heavy feeders, the light feeders, shallow rooted, the deep rooted, and looking at grains, legumes, forbs, and oil seeds. And that's what we rotate through this to make this work. So our rotations break up weed cycles, insect and disease cycles, and some crops can control perennial weeds like alfalfa. We can control our Canada thistle with alfalfa. Some add nutrients like buckwheat can solubilize phosphorus and bring it up for the next crops to use. So the result is we have no chemical herbicides, no pesticides. We add no poisons to our land, our air, our plants, and therefore we add no poisons to our food. And we focus on high nutrition. So that's what we're focusing on. We're not focusing on high yield as much as we're focusing on high nutrition. Okay, go to the next one. We go. And so the good food, I think, starts with good seed in healthy soil. So good seed comes from careful selections of high nutrition. Healthy soil comes from legumes and grown and worked into the soil about every second year. That's what we're doing on our farm. One crop is for sale, rotates with another crop for soil. We use peas, yellow Boston sweet clover, alfalfa. Now we're working with alfalfa kerns and sainfoin cocktails to be grazed off instead of hayed and be worked in as green manures. And so again, the results are no chemical fertilizers. We feed the soil microbes, they feed our plants, then the plants feed the soil microbes, and then it just goes round and round in an eternal cycle. Okay. So this is our 9-year rotation goal. I mean, it's not set in concrete. Okay, we do vary depending on what's going on in the fields and in the year. But generally, we're starting with winter wheat, requires the most nitrogen. It's our biggest producer. We go from the fall seeded peas after that for our green manure crop, second year. Then we'll go to hulless barley. Thank you. Keep me straight now. Okay. We'll go to hulless barley or lentils or chickpeas and underseed that with yellow Boston sweet clover. The fourth year then is yellow Boston sweet clover, which is a green manure, and there's no crop for sale either. And then we go to Kamut Coruscant, which I'll talk about in a second here, for spring wheat, followed by spring seeded peas for green manure in the 6th year. Then we go to high oleg, safflower, underseeded with alfalfa kerns and sainfoin, and then a hay cocktail, which is hay or graze. In the 9th year, that cocktail is worked back into the soil and we start all over again. So that's the variation of what we do. All right, go ahead. So now I'm going to talk to you about the nutritional part of this story. How did I get the idea that food should be our medicine, or there was anything different between one wheat and another wheat, for example? So my introduction to that came through an ancient grain, Kamut, a Coruscant wheat. And this is how the story unwrapped. So started out in the county fair in Fort Benton, Montana in 80 or 63. I was a sophomore in high school and went to the fair, and here this old man was next to the fair grandstands, and he had a can of Folgers, old red Folgers coffee can in his hand. He said, "Hey, Sonny, come on over here." He says, "Would you like some of King Tut's wheat?" And I said, "Oh, well, sure." And I held out my hand, and he poured this giant wheat into my hand. It was about 3 times the size as regular wheat. And the story was that this grain had come from Egypt. And there was a fellow from our county that was in the service in Portugal. He went to the bar one night, and the guy next to him said, "Oh," he said, "I just got back from furlough in Egypt. Look what I found in the tomb." And he poured out this a couple handfuls of grain, and this the guy from Montana said, "Oh my gosh," he says, "my dad's a wheat farmer." He said, "Do you think I could send some of that home?" And I don't know what kind of a deal they made, but he got talking about 32 kernels, and he sent home to his dad, and he planted them all, and they all grew, which actually should have been the first clue that probably didn't come out of a tomb after 4,000 years. But it didn't matter. Everybody loved the story. You know, they called it King Tut's wheat, and off they went. I went to, just a different thing, I went to Egypt then a few years later, and I was so excited. I went to the Cairo Museum, found out where the tomb collections were, where the grain was, and some of these tombs had been taken out. And I hurried up to the display, and I peeked over through the glass, and right before my eyes was einkorn. It wasn't when I was growing at all. I thought, oh man, I've been telling this story for years, and now I can't even verify that it's true. And so I was pretty bummed out about that. We were working with a project in Turkey a few years later, and my friends in Turkey said, "Oh, we know this grain." He said, "We call it the camel tooth because it's kind of the way it's shaped." I got some in my hat. I'll show you later. And it's kind of big on one end, small on the other, has a crook in it. And or he says, "We call it the prophet's wheat." I said, "Oh, that's really interesting. Why do you call it the prophet's wheat?" I said, "Does it have something to do with Muhammad?" Because, you know, Turkey, it's pretty Muslim there. I didn't want to get in the wrong side of that discussion. I was all by myself. And he says, "Oh, no, not that prophet." He says, "You know, the one with the boat." I said, "The boat? The boat?" I said, "You mean Noah?" "Oh, yes. This is the grain Noah brought with him on the ark." I said, "Wow, that's a lot better story than my old tomb story." So... And then I've got friends in Armenia, you know, and they're right across the border from Turkey, and they claim Mount Ararat too, and they have the same legend. So you know what the good book says, "In the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall all things be established." I said, "That's good enough for me." So anyway, so I saw this grain, and then what happened? Go ahead. So I don't know what I did with it. I put it in my pocket or something. I don't know. Anyway, 14 years later, I was in California. I'm taking a little break at my graduate school lab, went down to and bought a package of corn nuts at the vending machine. I came back, and I was reading on the back of this package, and it said, "Corn nuts made with a giant corn." I thought, I wonder if corn nuts would be interested in a giant wheat. So I called them up, and I said, "Oh, yeah, we'd be interested in that. Sure, send us some." Calling my dad, I said, "Dad, see if you can find some of that old King Tut wheat stuff." And about a week later, he called back and said, "Well, I found a jar. About a pint, about 2/3 full, a few heads in it." And I said, "Send me a couple tablespoons." I sent that to Corn Nuts. And in a few weeks, they called back and they said, "Wow, this is really good stuff. This is terrific. We'll take 10,000 pounds right now." And I said, "Whoa, well, I don't really have 10,000 pounds today." I didn't want to tell them I only had a pint, you know. And I said, "But if you give me a year or two, I'll have everything you want." And I called up my dad. I said, "Dad, plant the whole thing." Luckily, it was spring, and he planted it all, and it all grew. And we thrashed it out by hand. He sent it to California, and we grew another crop in the fall. So we had 2 crops a year for about 2 or 3 years, and we had 50 pounds. And we called up Corn Nuts and said, "Okay, we're ready to go." And the person that I had talked to that had done the first test was gone. The people that were left there, they didn't know anything about it, and they didn't even care. They weren't interested at all. So we missed our mark. So we put the 50 pounds in the shed, and there it sat for 3 or 4 years. And so I had another 5-year delay. So then, meanwhile, Montana Flour Grains in 1985, now we started, we got a stone flour mill from Austria. We started making stone ground whole wheat flour. In those days, that was really the big thing. Everybody wanted stone ground flour. So that's what we had. But now we had more overhead and more bills to pay. So we had to do some more marketing. So we started to go to food shows. We went to our first food show in 86. So my parents went down, helped me out. We had no idea in the world what we were doing. We built our own booth. We got a small flour mill, similar to the bigger ones that we were using from Austria that a friend of ours in California had bought. And my dad had taken this little jar of this ancient wheat down. He was showing it to everybody. And at the end of 3 days, thousands of people went by our booth. And my cousin and I who were doing the wheat business, Montana Farm Grains, he was my California connection. He took care of the customers. I took care of the quality control in Montana. We had our pockets full of business cards. We were so excited. And my dad had one business card and one interest for his giant wheat, this ancient wheat. And he was really excited. So we came home and we got that 50 pounds out of the shed and we planted the whole thing on 1/2 acre. So in 1986, we started out with one farm, ours, 1/2 acre, 0 products, 0 income. And 30 years later, and you can look at chapter 5 if you want to get all the details on that in the book. But 30 years later, we were working with 250 organic farms in Montana, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. We were contracting over 100,000 acres and had over 3,500 different products throughout the world. Most of them, 75%, were in Italy. Italy just exploded with this because it's turned out to be a near relative of Durham, made wonderful pasta, some of the best tasting pasta that some of them ever had, and it just took off. So that was really like a picture book Hollywood story, right? It was just everything was going perfect until about 10 years ago. They started finding glyphosate contamination on our grain in Italy. And in Italy, the level of glyphosate allowed on organic is 10 parts per billion, 10 ppb. Guess what it is in America? After Monsanto started realizing they're going to start selling this as a desiccant, and they knew there's going to be high levels on the food because it was sprayed right before harvest, and it was going to be contaminating the grain or the peas or whatever they were spraying, they went to EPA and got the level of legal limit of glyphosate raised 2 or 3 times. So now it is up to 30 parts per million on your food that they say is okay. If the organic allowance is 5% of the EPA tolerances, so 5% of 30 is 1,500 parts per billion compared to 10 that's allowed in Italy. So you see there's a big difference there. We never even looked at levels that low. In fact, in those days, about 10, 15 years ago, you couldn't even measure it that low, and it's consistently. So we never thought about it. We were measuring at 50 parts per billion, and we never saw anything. But at 10, they started to see stuff. And then we crossed 10, and then we had a recall. And I can't tell you what a mess that was. We lost 60% of our business in about 3 years in Italy. So it was a disaster for us. We hired an outfit because in Italy, they said, oh, well, your farmers are spraying at night. I said, I don't think any of our farmers are spraying at night. We know who they are, but they don't do that. But we had to figure out what was going on. So we hired an outfit from Germany. It cost us $60,000 to come over and spend a whole summer trying to trace this down. And after a full summer of trying to figure out where the glyphosate was coming from, they ended up with a solution. It was in the rain. It was in the rain that was falling on our farms. And there was enough in some areas that about 1/4 or up to 30% of our farms were contaminated over this level that we couldn't go to Italy anymore, including my farm, which I took as a big frustration, I'll tell you what. And so I've been studying that ever since, and studying and taking rain samples every year. And it does vary for the drought years where there's less glyphosate being used, there's less glyphosate in the rain. And in wetter years, it's just the opposite. So we're having to we spend about $500,000 in testing every year on every field of what comes out of our field to guarantee our customers the levels that are below the requirements for organic for glyphosate. So it's a real frustration for us. But we're on the way back. But I didn't want to dwell on that. I wanted to tell you how it took off and got to 100,000 acres in the first place. That's a much more fun story. My dad was giving away samples of pasta when we first had it made in the late 80s. And he gave it to this gal in Havre who had all kinds of wheat food sensitivities and wheat sensitivity. She couldn't eat wheat. I made her sick. But she did a kinesiology test, muscle test that she could do, and she felt like, well, I can try this, and maybe it'll be okay. And so she ate it, and she called up the next day and she said, "What is this stuff? Because when I eat it, I feel better." She said, "Wow, well, we'll give you some more." And so we gave her some more, and she says, I have a sister that has all kinds of not only wheat but other sensitivities, other foods that she cannot eat. Can I send her some? So, oh, sure, we'll send her a whole box full. So we sent her a whole box of this pasta. And after a month, she called back and she said, not only could I eat it, but after I ate it for several weeks, I was less sensitive to other foods that I was having trouble with. So it's actually healing her body in some way. We don't know if it's, leaky gut syndrome or what, but now she's less sensitive to other foods because of the healing that's going on with this grain. And when that happened, then my whole... it wasn't a novel to me anymore. It was like a gift from the Lord. It was like it was something to heal us and nourish us. And so at that point, we decided to go ahead and register a trademark to sell it, to protect the grain. So trademark doesn't mean we own the wheat, but it means that when you market it, you make guarantees to your customers. And our guarantees was that it was always organically grown. Thank you. That was 100% ancient Coruscant is a common name for this wheat. It's a very close relative of durum, as I told you. It's a tetraploid. It's high in protein and minerals. We guarantee that. And the claims had to be supported by research. So now the scientists in me kind of sprung back up. I said, this is so interesting. I just love to do the research to figure out what's going on. We tried to find people in America to do research for us. And this is now the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s. In those days, most of the medical and research personnel felt like this wheat, thank you, the wheat problem was all, was in their head. They said, that's just in their head. That's not real. There's nothing the matter with our wheat. Our wheat's fine. We have the best wheat in the world. And that was the attitude. And yet people were having trouble. And so we went to Italy, and in Italy, they had a different perspective. If you couldn't eat pasta, well, they weren't going to figure out why. They weren't going to run down and get wheat-free, gluten-free. They wanted their pasta the way they were used to it. And so we found some very interested research partners in University of Bologna, University of Florence. And after, the next about 13 years of research, we had 37 peer-reviewed journal articles. And these are not easy to come by. So we had designed experiments. We found really early on that the grain was anti-inflammatory. It reduced inflammation. And so we know that all chronic disease is tied to inflammation. So we went immediately to study chronic disease. So we studied irritable bowel syndrome, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, non-alcoholic fatty liver syndrome, fibromyalgia. And the results were so consistent. There were double-blind crossover studies. People didn't know what they were eating. We gave them both ancient wheat and modern wheat. They're both organic, so there wasn't any question about pesticide contamination or anything like that. So they're both organic, and we gave them bread and flour and crackers and pasta. And they ate one diet for 6 weeks, and they had a washout period where they ate whatever they wanted, and then they crossed over and ate the other diet for 6 weeks. So they had an internal control. So it was a very tight scientific design. And when the results came in, they were all very consistent. The biggest difference was anti-inflammatory properties were 30 to 45% increased. So the inflammation was going down by this much. You can't even do that with pills. Medicine can't do that. But we're seeing it time after time with the difference between our ancient and modern wheat. The antioxidant capacity was going up. Cholesterol, blood sugar, insulin resistance was going down. Magnesium, zinc, calcium levels in the blood were all going up. Now it started to dawn on me that food really could be our medicine. Medicine could be our food, just as Hippocrates said 2,300 years ago. So it's not a new idea. Okay. So what's happened to wheat, folks? I mean, it's the staff of life. I summarized my 30-year conversion from 86 to 16 when I rented out my farm. I went from using chemicals and poisons to grow high yields, to regenerative organic agriculture to feed the soil, to grow high quality and as much nutrition as possible. I went from so-called conventional ag, which is really not conventional at all. It's a great chemical experiment of the last 70 years or so. So then many of the wheels are coming off that bus with resistance and all kinds of problems. I went from that to real conventional ag of the last, mimicking what they've done in the last 10,000 years. It's kind of like going back to the future with a little science, focusing on the soil. From growing and selling wheat and barley as commodities, to growing and selling a great variety of specialty crops, grains, and seeds as food, from accepting pills as food, to enabling chronic ill to function, to promoting food as medicine to heal chronic disease and maintain health and vitality. Okay, so that's where I went to. Now, what's new? Well, none of my kids came back. I didn't want to sell the farm and ruin them with all that money. So we decided to take about a third of it out of the middle and create a regenerative organic research, education, and health institute. We call it the Quinn Institute. And our mission is healing the earth by growing food as medicine. Okay, there's going to be a whole bunch of skips through now. So we have, okay, I told you that already. So I have research, which is solving the challenges of converting and maintaining regenerative organic systems, managing weeds, rotation, studying new crops, perfecting the use of spent oil for fuel. We have education outreach with demonstrations and field days, short courses, gardening, fruit and berry production, cooking, preserving food. We want to teach people what to do with a turnip if we can get them that far to grow their own. Farm to table events, mentoring farmers who want to convert to organic. We have a health aspect. We want to have health practitioners on staff that focus on chronic disease and mental health and prescribe to their patients food from the farm rather than pills from the pharmacy. Okay, so go to the next one. So our region is a short grass prairie of the northern Great Plains. It takes in parts of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Montana, the Dakotas, a little bit of Wyoming, and a little bit of Nebraska. Okay, go to the next one. So this is our first annual report. We have 15 research projects working on 9 educational outreach projects. We did 17 public presentations, and you can get it online at our website is quinninstitute.org. Okay, so one of the projects we did was an outreach. You know, our kids are growing up, even those on big farms, hardly ever see food production. And so we're doing a lot of experiments with dry land vegetables, and potatoes is one of them. So we invited the entire grade school out, that's only about 60, to show them the potato patch that was then destined to the school for their lunch program. Okay, and we had a friend who had a team of horses and a potato digger, and the kids got to see the potatoes being dug. They just thought it was wow. And then they went out, go to the next slide, and they helped pick up all the potatoes and harvest the potatoes. So one of the things I'm trying to teach the rising generation is there's really no such thing as a free lunch, you see. But if you can have a part of the harvest and enjoy the fruits of your labor, this is the way you really learn about food and appreciate about where things are coming from and what you eat. So from these boxes of potatoes, I put the root cellar, and we take them to school every month, whatever they need for that month, and the kids are eating them, and they're just thrilled to be eating the fruits of their labor, sort of thing. So that's been really fun. Okay, go ahead to the next one. A couple other things that we're doing over the past years, we started a business called the Oil Barn to produce high oleic safflower oil. High oleic is monounsaturated. It's really good for your heart. And go ahead, go to the next one. And so here are our presses. It's cold pressed, non-refined. The first idea was to use it for fuel, but one of my hired men, isn't it great to have a hired man that takes a little initiative? Sometimes it really, wow, opens up a door you never thought of. He took some to the local restaurant. They said, this makes the best French fries we've ever tasted. We'll pay you $2 a pound for this. Well, it didn't take I'm not much of a mathematician, but $2 a pound is about $16 a gallon. And I decided I'm not going to put that on my tractor. And so we started selling, go to the next one, to the folks at, we supply all the oil for Montana State University of Montana for their kitchens. And we have retail bottles we sell, and also to cosmetic companies. But from the university, we get the used fry oil back. I clean it up, and I put it in my tractor. I get to sell it twice. And if a farmer can sell his crop twice, this really helps the bottom line, you see. And so there's enough fry oil produced in Montana, or used in that fry house in Montana, to run all of agriculture. Imagine if we could grow all of our own fuel oil. I mean, I know you can grow sunflowers here. For us, we can't grow those, but you can do high oleic sunflower and do the same thing. If we can keep the expense we spend on fuel local and turning in a local economy, imagine what that would do. Okay, go ahead. Another thing we're doing is making snacks, fried snacks, whether we fried in our safflower oil and add a little salt to the kamut. We make go ahead, the next one. We make a crackling kamut. Has 3 ingredients, oil, grain, and salt, as I mentioned. Now we're selling our grain by the ounce. This is also an advantage, rather than selling it by the carload. We've been able to, okay, the future, so what are we doing in the future? We can grow apples. There's only about 200 varieties of apples that survive zone 3. That's 40 below. That's where we are. And but we have found about 30 or so that we're experimenting with now. And a few of them are very, very good. We can grow sour cherries. We can't grow sweet cherries, but we can take the sour cherry juice, mix it with the apple juice, and make a wonderful, not too many. And so why don't we grow stuff that we can sell and as a benefit to us right there? So that's one of the things we're working on for the future. Another thing we're working on is dry land vegetables. So we're doing onions and potatoes and melons. People ask me about climate change, and I said, well, I don't know about, it seems to me it's more climate chaos than it is climate change, because that's what I see, just everything is chaotic. It's from one extreme to another. But I said, when I was a kid, I planted watermelon every year. I never had anything bigger than a softball. Never got ripe, never was any good. And now we have 30-pound watermelons sometimes, and they're delicious and ripe. And anyway, we can do other things. I have a subterranean greenhouse just for fun, just to let you know I'm don't spend all my time in the lab or on the science books. And so in conclusion, how many minutes have we got? Am I over time yet?
Give me 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, I'll go through this real quick. In conclusion, so to make a change, we must educate the eaters of America. The fastest growing segment of food and agriculture today is organic in America. We're 6% now of the total. Okay, go ahead, keep flipping through these. And our job is to feed the world, but we have lots of detractors. What do they say to us? They say our job is to feed the world. We'll starve if we all go organic. Our answer to that is our job is to help the world feed itself, I think. In non-industrial world, organic can increase the yield 2 to 3 times just by focusing on soil building. Okay. They say there's no future in organic. Our answer is the only future that makes sense. They say organic is too expensive. We say the real cost of cheap food is completely unaffordable. Here's why. So who's paying the high cost of cheap food? First of all, the farmers. Most of the farmers in my neighborhood, half of them are gone. They can't afford to be paid less than it costs them to raise their commodities, and so they don't continue. Go ahead, and the next one. When they're gone, then who suffers? The communities suffer. So again, remember I showed you half our small town, Main Street was boarded up, and we have long supply lines. then the earth suffers. The earth is paying a price. We have chemical pollutions. We have dead zones in the Gulf of Mexico, the size of New Jersey. How big does it have to get before we think maybe we're going the wrong direction? A lot of people can't drink the water from the wells because of nitrogen or nitrate levels, glyphosates in our rain. We have climate change going on. We have the health of our people. 60% now are chronically ill, and 60% of that, the CDC says, is due to poor food. So we all pay more and more taxes with no end in sight. Okay, go ahead, the next one. So the solution, I don't want to leave on the downside. The solution is grow food as medicine. And I'm using regenerative organic agriculture. For our farms, we can reduce the cost of our inputs, increase the value of our outputs, increase the profitability and sustainability of our farms. For our communities, we increase financial support with healthy farm economy, increase jobs with local processing, reduce the risk of long supply lines. For our earth, we can reduce poisons and pollutions, increasing carbon and organic matter in the soil, reduce fuel use to ship our food great distances. For health of our people, we can produce nutrient-dense food with less chemical residues, and for everybody wins. Our farmers, our communities, our earth, and our people. Okay. So let's dream a little bit. Can we dream a little bit just to end up with? So what if we paid farmers by quality rather than quantity? Pounds of nutrition per acre rather than tons of commodities per acre? What if we labeled foods for nutritional value, driving the market toward good food instead of just cheap food? What if we paid a little more for good food and a lot less for sick care, using food as medicine instead of pills for food. What if we increase food security by eating locally grown and minimally processed food, keeping more money at home instead of enriching giant food companies? What if we paid farmers as pharmacists instead of enriching big pharma? What if we help farmers grow their own inputs instead of enriching international chemical and oil companies who extract the wealth from rural America? All this can be accomplished with regenerative organic agriculture. Okay, this is what's happened. The last 35 years, we've gone to near 0 to 6%. We're a current rate of growth of organic about 8% a year. In 35 more years, that could go to 100%. We could change the scene of agriculture and food in America. Here's how y'all can be a part of that. And this is my last slide, I think. So you want to be a part of this? Go ahead. So be the change you want to see. Experiment with a little organic. If you're not doing it now, just start with a little bit. Put one more item of organic food in your cart every time you go shopping. Encourage your local schools, hospitals, and nursing homes to serve organic. Volunteer to lecture at your local school and offer them to come to your farm for tours. Encourage restaurants and organizations that you belong to serve organic food. Grow a garden, eat from it, and eat from what you grow in your fields. Form farm improvement clubs or any kind of gatherings to help each other in your local neighborhood, encourage each other, and reduce farm waste or food waste from the current 40 to 50% and encourage others to do the same thing. Ask USDA to fund organic research and promotion programs at the same percent as the total of organic food being sold in America. It's not even close now. So with that, I say to eat organic, grow organic, eat nutritious, eat local, be wise, be well, be thankful, be kind, and thank you very much for your attention. Okay.
Thank you so much. We are